Marlon Brando played the Godfather. Vincent Gigante was called the Oddfather.
He would walk the streets in a bathrobe. He would urinate in public.
He would allow himself to be embarrassed, to be ridiculed. He'd been faking this Howard Hughes act for all these years.
Gigante was the boss of what's known as the Ivy League of organized crime.
Gigante was probably the shrewdest, most clandestine, wise guy that ever walked the streets of New York.
Throughout the 1980s, Vincent "Chin" Gigante could be seen shuffling along Sullivan Street in New York's Greenwich Village. He wore bedroom slippers and a tattered bathrobe. His hair was uncombed, and he sported a day's growth of gray whiskers. The average New Yorker assumed he was crazy.
He looked like he was living the life of a psychiatric invalid, a pathetic street person who otherwise would be carrying a cup.
But by the mid-1980s, state and federal investigators were beginning to think that Gigante might be very sane and very dangerous. He was often accompanied on his rambles by high-ranking members of the New York Mafia. People with names like Benny Eggs and Baldy Dom.
I don't think that any powerful wise guy from another crime family or a powerful wise guy from his own crime family would want to be seen voluntarily walking around with a person who is just deranged.
The FBI hoped to link Chin to at least 6 Mafia hits and the attempted murder of mob boss John Gotti. Investigators also believed Gigante controlled the Genovese family's vast criminal enterprises, including extortion and drug running. But they needed to take the veil off his crazy act. So the FBI began to follow his every move. Vincent Gigante started his day in the afternoon. He emerged from 225 Sullivan Street, where he had lived with his mother on and off for more than 20 years. He had long been estranged from his wife. Although 6 feet tall and 200 pounds, Gigante looked like a frail, confused man. He wore a rumpled bathrobe and often held the arm of a friend or family member. Crossing Sullivan Street, he stepped inside an old storefront. Behind the creaking door and soaked windows was the headquarters of the Triangle Social Club.
The term social club is a little bit misleading. Strangers would not be permitted. There's no membership. There's no membership list. There are no dues that are taken. And these would be places for people in organized crime literally to associate.
The FBI believed that it was from here that this seemingly feeble man directed the family's violent criminal activities. Agents were desperate to put him away. Often, at around 11 p.m., a sedan would pull up outside the club. A mobster would help Gigante into the back seat and drive him to an address on Manhattan's Upper East Side. Here, Gigante had created a second family with his mistress.
This is where Chin would come late at night, sometimes 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. This was occupied by Olympia Esposito and Chin and their kids.
Late one night, I observed him with the bathrobe on, but I was close enough to him at the time to realize that underneath the bathrobe, he had a sharkskin suit on and a necktie.
Gigante's perspective on law enforcement is that they probably would much prefer to work daytime than night shifts, and he'd reduce the risk of being surveilled if he conducted his business off hours. And he was right.
In the morning, Gigante returned to his mother's home. To conceal Gigante's true role as one of the most powerful Mafia dons and head of the Genovese crime family, his associates never spoke his name. If someone needed to mention him, they'd touch their chin in reference to Gigante's nickname. It was a practice that made federal wiretaps almost useless.
Gigante was a remarkably shrewd boss. He created a very formidable fortress around him that made it almost impossible to put together a case with meaningful evidence to prosecute him.
Once, when an FBI agent served a subpoena to Gigante's home, it was the agent who was surprised.
Gigante's mother let him in. The agent walked through the apartment, and when he got to the bathroom, he observed that Gigante was in the shower, with the shower running, with an umbrella over his head and galoshes on.
All of his efforts to present himself as someone other than the boss of the Genovese crime family through these maneuvers were truly effective.
By November 1987, agents were investigating mob influence over Local 580 of the Ironworkers Union. They suspected that Vincent Gigante was working with other crime families to control high-level construction jobs and to fix bids on the projects. The feds used a mob underboss turned rat named Peter Savino to record conversations they hoped would incriminate Gigante.
Remember Uniseal? Vincent had said, when it came time to bid, okay, I'll mention him. He had said to go out and bid the work. Yes.
After listening to more than 100 hours of coded conversations about bid rigging, extortion, and other illegal schemes, agents were able to build a case against Gigante. On May 30th, 1990, FBI agents pulled up to Gigante's mother's apartment in the Village. After a 2-year investigation, the FBI had enough evidence to arrest him. Gigante was wearing pinstripe pajamas and a blue bathrobe as 2 agents escorted him from the building. Now, the government's challenge was to prove that this seemingly feeble, confused man was actually a criminal mastermind of New York's Genovese crime family. In May of 1990, the FBI arrested Vincent Chin Gigante. Gigante didn't act like a man who ruled a crime family with over 1,000 made members and associates. But the government believed he had ordered 6 murders and masterminded a $1 million Mafia extortion scheme. As Gigante was taken to the federal courthouse, reporters flocked to get a look at the mysterious godfather.
Out comes this disheveled, old-looking individual who's supposedly the boss of the most powerful crime family in the United States. It's just a jarring sight.
Prosecutors claimed that Gigante's erratic behavior was nothing but a ruse intended to keep him out of jail.
The only important thing to him was power, and the only way to maintain that power was not to be convicted. So he would allow himself to be embarrassed, to be actually ridiculed. He didn't care, because he knew within his own environments he was known as a godfather, and that's what counted to him.
The importance of power was something Gigante had learned about growing up on the streets of Lower Manhattan. In the early 1920s, Italian immigrants Salvatore Gigante and his wife Yolanda settled in Manhattan's Greenwich Village neighborhood.
It was an area of an Italian enclave in the vicinity of NYU and Washington Square Park. His parents had lived there almost from the first day they arrived from Naples.
Yolanda gave birth to her son Vincent on March 29, 1928. He was one of 5 children, This did not constitute a large family among the Italian immigrants in the village. In fact, there were so many children in the neighborhood, the Gigantes had trouble calling Vincent home for supper.
There were several Vinnies or Vincents in the neighborhood. Everyone would get a label, Vinny Four Eyes or Vinny Long Legs. His mother always referred to him as Cinzenzo, which is a diminutive for Vincent, and he became known as Chin, Vinny Chin.
As a young boy, Chin Gigante's education began on the porch stoops and alleyways of Greenwich Village. The streets were ruled by La Cosa Nostra, or Mafia. Chin learned early that men like Vito Genovese and Lucky Luciano were to be respected and feared.
If you wanted to park your truck in a spot where it could be easily unloaded, you had to pay somebody. If you wanted to get your truck loaded quickly, you had to pay somebody.
In grammar school, Gigante was tall for his age, with broad shoulders and a stocky build. He applied the lessons he learned in the streets to the schoolyard.
He used to extort 15 cents from kids from their lunch money of the 25 cents that their parents had given them. The kids paid up. They didn't want to deal with the Chin.
In 1942, Chin Gigante dropped out after the 9th grade. At 15, he started to learn the tailor's trade.
It was not at all unusual for first-generation Italian families to encourage their children to find employment as quickly as possible.
But Gigante never worked as a tailor. Instead, he hung out in the village and looked for opportunities to make a quick buck. One possibility was neighborhood boxing matches or club fights.
You had to sell tickets. You got a percentage of the tickets you sold in the neighborhood.
Chin was good with his hands. I've heard that he won 13 out of 14 boxing matches. I've heard he won 23 out of 24. Some of those bouts, no matter what the correct numbers are, were obviously fixed. Mob guys hung out in boxing rings, always looking to get a handle or a piece on an up-and-coming young fighter.
One of those mobsters was Thomas Tommy Ryan Eberly. Eberly liked what he saw in the young boxer and decided to become Gigante's manager. Gigante would canvass the neighborhood selling tickets for his matches and chatting up the locals.
I grew up in that same era. Neighborhood fighters were like stars. They were important people.
In the ring, Gigante earned a reputation as a quick-witted boxer with powerful fists. The mob took notice.
Vincent Gigante was beginning to show entrepreneurial spirit. At this rather young age, he was already showing how he could work for bookmakers, how he could bring income in both for them and for himself. He was showing them that he was a good worker, he was an earner, and in fact, he was making his move to be part of organized crime.
During his late teens and early 20s, Chin was a gangster in training. He did the things that all wise guy wannabes do when they're looking to move up in the life of crime and become, associated with the mob family of choice. He was involved in bookmaking. He was a runner.
Then, in 1950, at the age of 21, Gigante found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time.
He was involved in a bookmaking ring, trying to hustle bets at a college in Brooklyn. And at that time, there was a crackdown by the local district attorney.
Vincent Gigante was convicted and served 60 days in a workhouse for distributing basketball betting cards to students. When he got out, the mob welcomed him back with open arms. Over the next few years, Gigante made a living as a bookie, chauffeur, and bodyguard for the Mafia's elite. But Chin was still waiting for a chance to make his mark. He was 29 when he earned the assignment that would make his career: to kill a mob boss, a godfather named Frank Costello. By 1950, Vincent Gigante had been a boxer and bookie for the New York Mafia. Now 21 years old, he decided to start a family. That year, he married Olympia Grippa. The couple settled into an apartment on Bleecker Street in Greenwich Village, not far from where Gigante had grown up. Once they started to have children, Chin worked hard to support his growing family.
He was an enforcer. He got involved in shoplifting, grand larceny, anything to make a buck. When you're doing things like that, you're trying to prove yourself to the older guys in the neighborhood.
But it wasn't until mobster Vito Genovese took Gigante under his wing that his criminal career began to take shape. During the mid-1950s, Genovese offered the brawny former boxer an opportunity to become his chauffeur.
It was sort of an apprenticeship program. He was both Genovese's driver and he was a guerrilla when it came to collecting loan shark debts, anything else. So in that way, he proved his mettle.
Gigante's new mentor was himself a man with ambitions. The current head of the family was Frank Costello, known as the Prime Minister of the underworld for his ability to influence local politicians. But many in the organization had seen their profits shrink during his reign. Vito Genovese thought he could take advantage of the discord.
Vito Genovese was tired of being number 2 and wanted to become number 1. So he enlisted the Chin to do a piece of work, and that was to take a shot at Frank Costello.
For Gigante, this was a chance to move up in the organization.
That's part of the oath when you become a made member of the Mafia. So you have to be willing to kill for this family and put this family above your own family.
On the night of May 2nd, 1957, Gigante waited in the lobby of Costello's Central Park West apartment building. Costello walked through the front door and headed for his apartment. Gigante was no more than 6 feet behind when he leveled a pistol at Costello's head. But before squeezing the trigger, Gigante decided to deliver a message.
Chin called out Costello's name. "This one's for you, Frank." Frank Costello turned and looked at him.
His bullet missed its mark. The shot only grazed Costello's left temple. Gigante fled, while Costello managed to make his way to Roosevelt Hospital. He left several hours later with a bandage around his head and blood on his cream-colored suit. He told reporters he never saw the gunman.
We know that Vincent Gigante was an extremely large, at that point, almost obese, and an ex-fighter, and very, very easily recognized. So Frank Costello obviously recognized who the attempted assassin was.
As police began to investigate the shooting, Genovese whisked his young lieutenant to a hideout in upstate New York. While in hiding, Gigante made his first attempt to avoid prosecution by changing his appearance. Chin went on a crash diet.
The description of the gunman was that he was 300 pounds and very tall. A very much thinner Vincent Gigante came back to the city and turned himself into police, saying, "I heard you were looking for me."
Police charged Gigante with attempted murder. His trial was set for May of 1958.
Surprisingly enough, a person who gave his occupation as both a janitor and as a tailor was able to hire, at that time, probably the best criminal lawyer in New York, a man by the name of Maurice Edelbaum, to defend him.
Vinny, did you give yourself up because you were afraid?
No, you're crazy.
Vinny!
As the trial got underway, the prosecution called Costello's doorman, their key witness to the shooting.
Edelbaum was able to really rattle him because the guy had some kind of sight problem. He had an eye infection, so he was able to question it.
Frank Costello took the stand. Under oath, he told the jury that he couldn't identify Gigante as the man who shot him.
When Costello left the witness stand, almost everybody in the courtroom heard Chin, in a kind of loud stage whisper, say, "Thanks, Frank."
Gigante was acquitted on May 27, 1958. But the mob had yet to pass judgment on the failed hit.
In ordinary circumstances, that would have been really the end of Vincent Gigante. He either would have been killed by loyalists of Frank Costello for attempting to kill the man, or he would have been killed by loyalists to Vito Genovese for blowing an assignment.
But instead, Gigante's failed hit helped him move up the Mafia's ranks when Costello decided to retire.
Frank Costello was smart enough to see the handwriting on the wall, and he wasn't going to hang around to see if he could withstand another attack, and just stepped down and lived out the rest of his life in relative peace and tranquility.
So instead of being executed, instead of being killed for a bungled hit, Gigante is brought into the crime family and now has great stature because he's connected with Vito Genovese, who's now the boss of that crime family. And his career was on the way up.
Gigante's ties to Genovese made him, for the first time, a target for the feds.
What is Gigante's relationship to you?
I think you fellas have asked enough questions, and I think you ought to leave Mr. Genovese alone.
Vincent Gigante would soon develop a new disguise to conceal his criminal activities. By the late 1950s, Vincent Chin Gigante's association with mob boss Vito Genovese had made him a key player in organized crime. His role in the attempted assassination of Frank Costello had elevated his position in the Mafia, but also brought him to the attention of federal authorities. In 1959, prosecutors convicted the 30-year-old Gigante and his mentor, 62-year-old Vito Genovese, of heroin trafficking.
Gigante was, according to our information, a protege of Genovese. He was a bright boy. He was the rising star of the underworld.
He was sentenced to 7 years in Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary. In time, Gigante learned to make the best of life in the big house.
I'm not sure that we had club fed, as might be portrayed, but certainly these people were not doing the kind of hard time that we would anticipate.
He managed to get along pretty well with the guards. He didn't cause any problems. He took care of educational programs, and he was kind of viewed by the federal prison system as a good inmate.
Gigante's good behavior shaved 2 years off his sentence. In 1964, he left prison and went straight back to the mob.
He came back, of course, right to Greenwich Village, to his home base, and in a very short time after that, he was made a capo, a captain in the family.
Gigante was now making good money, even while his mentor, Vito Genovese, sat in prison. Soon, Gigante moved his wife Olympia and their 5 children out of their New York apartment and into a house in the suburbs.
He suddenly had a lot of money, and he set up his family in a suburban town called Old Tappan, New Jersey. But he always kept an apartment in Greenwich Village, where he lived with his mother and other relatives.
The 5 years he'd spent in prison were etched in Gigante's mind.
He said to himself, there's never any way I'm coming back to this institution or any place like this ever again.
Before long, Chin would develop a new strategy to avoid another prosecution.
The idea of the Crazy Act came about first time in 1969. Gigante was arrested in New Jersey on a charge of bribing the entire 5-member police force of Old Tappan.
After learning he was being investigated, Gigante checked himself into a mental hospital. His brother, Louis, a Catholic priest, claimed Vincent was mentally ill, suffering from dementia and taking medication for paranoid schizophrenia. He explained to the press that Vincent was just giving the policemen tips as Christmas presents.
And his lawyers managed to bring in evidence or that he'd been undergoing psychiatric treatment, that he was emotionally disturbed. And the charges were dropped.
After a scrape with New Jersey authorities, it appears a rift developed between Gigante and his wife. In the years that followed, Gigante was rarely seen at the family's home in Old Tappan. He eventually took a mistress and put her up in a townhouse on Manhattan's Upper East Side.
Interestingly, Chin Gigante's wife is named Olympia, and his paramour of many years is also named Olympia Esposito.
So this was a guy who could never make a mistake when he woke up. Whatever name he uttered in his sleep was the right name.
In 1969, Vito Genovese, Gigante's friend and mentor, died in Springfield, Missouri's Medical Center for Federal Prisoners. But New York's other mafia bosses still operated with little interference from the FBI. That began to change in 1970 when Congress passed what became known as the RICO Act.
The Racketeer Influence Corrupt Organizations Act enabled the government to pursue not just individuals but organizations, enterprises, and in particular, organized crime families.
Armed with the RICO statutes, law enforcement could now aggressively target the mob's leadership.
The Genovese crime family decided to put upfront bosses in place to kind of take the heat as the person who was really the boss, while the real boss, meanwhile, was sitting in the background.
For the next 10 years, the mob played an intricate shell game with the feds, concealing which mobster was really the godfather. Many believe that during this time, Vincent Chin Gigante completed his climb from chauffeur and enforcer to become the most powerful godfather in the Mafia. Now vulnerable to prosecution, Gigante developed a complex chain of communication to hide his true role.
He told all of his guys to make sure they never uttered his name.
And they couldn't even refer to his name, his nickname, Chin.
They made motions like this when they spoke about him.
He once tried to get the Lucchese family to kill a very important member because on some tape he'd been picked up and he had mentioned the name Chin. This was his protective shield.
It was only a matter of time before someone slipped up. During the 1980s, federal investigators had successfully infiltrated the mob. By 1986, they knew Gigante was planning a hit on rival crime boss John Gotti.
The FBI taped some New Jersey Genovese mobster saying they had got a contract from Chin to kill Gotti.
When the car bomb meant for Gotti took the life of one of his lieutenants, the feds began to close in on Gigante. For the next 10 years, Gigante would check himself into and out of mental hospitals. He used these frequent visits to shield himself from prosecution. Investigators called it his act. Then, in 1990, the man they dubbed the Odd Father found himself in court once again. But while other mobsters were being jailed on racketeering charges, the feds could not convict Gigante. Once again, his bizarre behavior kept him out of prison. In the mid-1980s, legislation known as the RICO Act allowed federal investigators to put away mob bosses. Men like Carmine Persico, head of the New York Colombo family, and Anthony Corallo, chief of the Lucchese family. In 1986, federal prosecutors convicted Fat Tony Salerno, the man they thought was the head of the Genovese family.
Fat Tony Salerno was a true blue gangster. He was not going to say, hey, I'm not the boss, you got the wrong guy.
The feds soon learned that the real godfather was Vincent "Chin" Gigante. But Gigante used his crazy act to avoid prosecution.
He would walk the streets of the village in a bathrobe. He would urinate in public. He would do things that no other boss in the history of La Cosa Nostra would catch himself doing ever in public.
Gigante seemed demented, but his organization was raking in millions. One of his most lucrative ventures was in construction.
The Genovese Crime Family and the Lucchese Crime Family started a company called Arista Windows.
In 1981, the New York Housing Authority decided to replace all the windows in their housing projects. Gigante wanted a piece of the action.
Approximately $170 million in contracts were awarded, and virtually all those contracts during that time period were the subject of bid rigging that were controlled by players with the support of these organized crime families.
When the FBI got wind of the deals, they were determined to bust the mob all the way to the top. To do it, they needed help from someone on the inside. The feds turned to another mobster, Peter Savino, who had been linked to several murders. Investigators offered to reduce his charges and put him in the witness protection program if he would become an informant.
Savino, whose nickname was Blackheart, was someone who Chin Gigante had protected from retribution when guys in the crime family had told Chin that he wasn't to be trusted.
Peter Savino put himself at risk for 18 months on the streets of New York, meeting with members and higher-ups of 4 crime families in New York.
Investigators were able to find other evidence that corroborated Savino. 2 mobsters, Robert DiBernardo and Angelo Ruggiero, actually mentioned Gigante's nickname in connection with Mafia business. In May of 1990, Gigante was indicted for racketeering. Gigante's defense attorney, Barry Slotnick, claimed his client was mentally ill. The judge ordered a hearing to determine if Gigante was fit to stand trial.
The government suggested 2 psychiatrists to a judge. They examined him, not in a cursory examination. They examined him, they put him in a lockup, in a federal lockup, in a hospital setting, where he was observed for 24 hours a day.
Vincent Gigante would say things like, "God told me not to, God told me it's cold outside, the dots of the Bender-Gestalt test make me nervous."
He successfully convinced court-appointed psychiatrists that he was crazy. They diagnosed him as a paranoid schizophrenic. They said he was psychotic. They said he was childlike. They said he was regressing.
The man is sick. We've been telling you this for 6 years. He's sick. He doesn't know what's going on.
As the hearing continued, the prosecution showed a different side of Vincent Gigante.
You look at the surveillance photos that the FBI has over the years. You see Chin Gigante wearing his ratty bathrobe, but he's smoking a cigarette in those photos, and it looks like he's chatting with associates on the street. In those surveillance photos, he doesn't look so crazy. But when you saw him in public being escorted into court, the crazy act was in full swing.
Prosecutors also pointed out that Gigante had been married for 40 years while he maintained relationships with his children and his mistress, Olympia Esposito.
A chronic schizophrenic would be someone who had very poor social skills, and the idea that Vincent Gigante was cultivating 2 families is incompatible with the way socially chronic schizophrenics are.
Gigante sounded normal enough when the FBI wiretapped his conversations with his mistress.
Oh, where'd he dance? The barber? He probably didn't know you was in there.
I know he was in there. He's on my face. You want me to take anything home?
No.
All right.
Okay.
See you later.
Talk to you later. Bye.
And ultimately what the court saw was that there were at least 3 lives of Vincent Gigante. There was the one that was described to a psychiatrist where he was a person who was an invalid who lived alone with his mother. There was the Vincent Gigante who had another family they spent a lot of time with in the Upper East Side. And there was the Vincent Gigante who made regular meetings with higher-ups of the Genovese, Colombo, Gambino, and Lucchese crime families.
Gigante had avoided prosecution for 7 years. Finally, in August 1996, Brooklyn's federal district court judge declared Vincent Gigante lucid and fit to stand trial. When Gigante showed up for the first day in court, he proved that he wasn't ready to abandon his act.
His lips quivered, his eyes looked all over the place, his arms were shaking on occasion, his leg would twitch.
The FBI put mob turncoat Sammy the Bull Gravano on the witness stand. Gravano testified that Gigante discussed killing informants and sharing extortion profits without any signs of mental illness.
I always wondered if I would ever see a sign of whether he was sane or not. And usually he just was hanging his head or mumbling as they wheeled him out. But one day there was an attractive woman standing off to the side. And as they wheeled him out, he looked her up and down once over, and then he looked at me and turned away quickly.
But the government's star witness was former mobster Peter Savino. Savino testified via closed-circuit television from his secret location in the Witness Protection Program.
At the time of the trial, Peter Savino was deathly ill, suffering from cancer, and you could see that on many occasions Savino was sitting in a chair and he was actually in pain.
Peter Savino testified nonetheless about all of his dealings with Gigante, the window industry, Local 580, homicides, you name it.
In the end, the jury didn't buy Gigante's act. On July 25, 1997, Vincent Gigante was found guilty and sentenced to 12 years in prison.
Bitter irony for Chin was 3 months later, Peter Savino died from cancer. And if Gigante had been able to hold out for another 4 months before being brought to trial, he might still be out there today instead of in a federal prison.
From his prison cell, Gigante maintained control over the Genovese family. Investigators knew that if they wanted to put an end to the reign of Chin Gigante, they would have to go after him one more time. For nearly 30 years, Mafia boss Vincent Chin Gigante stayed out of prison by convincing doctors, judges, and even the media that he was insane.
Sir, can you tell us how your father's doing?
Very sick. Didn't you see that?
Do you think he'll be able to go to trial?
Finally, in 1997, federal investigators managed to convict the wily Mafia boss. Even behind bars, Gigante kept up the charade of a mentally ill man while he continued to run the family business.
Gigante was still delivering messages to the crime family from his jail cell, and I believe that his son was delivering those messages to the associates on the street.
For the next 3 years, agents watched Gigante closely. They kept track of his phone calls and monitored his interaction with guards and other prisoners. Slowly but surely, his facade began to crack.
On 9/11, some other inmates were watching television, and they knew that Gigante was from New York, and they told him about it, and he then watched what everyone else watched on television, which is the planes hitting the World Trade Center, and quickly got a call through to his family to check, to make sure that everybody was okay. Of course, this was being recorded by the Bureau of Prisons.
Some of those taped conversations with both his wife and his girlfriend were among those that the prosecution intended to use at trial to prove that he really was lucid and able to speak in full sentences and really knew what was going on.
Investigators realized that the best way to get Gigante was to go after his family. The first thing they did was arrest his son Andrew.
So in effect, even though Andrew was never a made man and he was never a soldier, Chin used him and at the same time got him implicated and got him convicted.
The feds had also threatened to go after other members of Gigante's family, who for years had insisted that he was an innocent man suffering from mental illness.
His family members, including Reverend Gigante, his daughters, and his sons, they would explain to the reporters anytime that they were asked that their father or their brother wasn't feeling so well or wasn't in good shape. They hoped that he would get through this.
The onslaught on my brother is really hurting my mother. It's hurting a whole family, that they accuse this incompetent person to be such a mobster when he hasn't been doing anything for the last 20 years but living a simple life in that little apartment.
But the feds increased pressure on Gigante by collecting evidence that family members had supported his crazy act. On April 7, 2003, in a deal with prosecutors, Vincent Gigante pleaded guilty to obstructing justice.
In the end, I think Gigante decided to plead guilty for two reasons. Number one, he knew there was no way he was going to beat the case. In addition, he was able to get a good plea bargain for his son Andrew.
His son got 2 years and paid a $2 million fine. That's a stiff fine, but 2 years in jail for some of the crimes that they were indicted for is not a significant amount of time.
And the reason why Chin agreed and pleaded guilty and admitted he'd been faking this Howard Hughes act for all these years was that he cleared his family, his personal family, his relatives. So what he did in effect was he gave them a pass. They were free. They were clear. And that was the reason he did it.
On the day that Vincent Gigante's 30-year charade came to an end, reporters said he looked relieved and even blew kisses to his family.
He didn't look like a mob godfather, but he looked like someone who obviously understood and fully comprehended what was going on. And that was the bottom line.
After serving 12 years for racketeering and 3 years for obstruction of justice, Vincent Gigante is scheduled to be released from prison on June 28th of 2010. Only time will tell if this was the final round for the former boxer turned mafia boss.
Chin comes out of good stock. His mother lived until the mid-90s. There is a good sense that he will be back out on the streets running the crime family, maybe not from the Triangle Social Club on Sullivan Street, but from somewhere in Greenwich Village.
Under basic rules of the Mafia, you're a godfather until you die, even if he's in prison. So as long as he's alive, he is still the godfather of the Genovese family.
Gigante is probably the last of the old school organized crime bosses. I don't think there'll ever be another Vincent Gigante or an individual like Vincent Gigante. He really is the last of his breed.